came every night into our basement, to all the basements, with their machine gun pointing at us, and raped the woman.
In one of history's darkest periods, the Nazis set up brothels in different parts of Europe as tools of control and manipulation. From brothels that were established in concentration camps as rewards for hard work to horrors faced by Polish women who were kidnapped and ended up in military-run brothels, the suffering was endless. What truly went on behind those closed doors? And how did the women manage to survive? This is what the Nazi brothels were like from the inside. The brothels of Nazi concentration camps. Imagine being promised a better life in the middle of a nightmare, only to find out the promise was a cruel trap. In 1942, the Nazis came up with a twisted plan. They thought prisoners in concentration camps would work harder if they dangled the chance of rewards in front of them. But these rewards were not food or freedom, they were sex. So the Schutzstaffel, or SS, set up brothels in the camps and forced female prisoners to work there, beginning with the Austrian camp at Mauthausen. By the time the war ended, there were 10 such brothels, the largest one in Auschwitz, where up to 21 women were made to work at any given time. Altogether, around 200 women were forced into these horrific roles. Jewish women were not chosen for these brothels, and neither Jewish inmates nor Soviet prisoners of war were allowed to visit them. At first, the SS tried to lure women in by promising better treatment or even a chance to reduce their sentences. It created envy and bitterness among the other prisoners. One Russian prisoner named Nina Mikhailovna recalled that whenever a woman from her block was selected, the others would beat her up out of anger, sometimes so brutally that the girl couldn't even move afterwards. It was their desperate way of punishing her for what they saw as trying to get a better life. Soon, however, the promises disappeared, and women were forced into the brothels against their will. Some were taken during roll calls, while others were dragged out of the camp's sickbay. The brothels were set up like barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, with small rooms where women were kept. A female overseer controlled them, and the women didn't stay long because they often became too sick or exhausted. When they couldn't go on, they were sent back to the regular part of the camp, like Birkenau, to live out their days as ordinary inmates. The brothels were only open in the evenings, and everything was tightly controlled. The rules in these places were strict. Prisoners who were allowed to use the brothels had to be Aryan VIPs, which ironically included some Polish Christian prisoners and criminals who wore green triangles on their uniforms. The men had to sign up for a time slot and pay 2 Reichsmarks for a visit. Once their permit was approved, they were assigned a woman and had to go through a medical check. If their name was called during the evening roll call, they would be marched to the brothel, where a doctor applied a medicinal cream to their genitals. Each woman was forced to serve an average of 5 men every day. The Nazi officers kept close watch. The SS even had spy holes in the walls to make sure everything was happening according to their strict rules. Only 15 minutes were allowed, and only in the missionary position. There were even rumors, though controversial, that some women were marked with tattoos on their chests that read Feldhure, which means field whore. There are also stories of forced sterilizations and abortions, some of which ended in the woman's death. Now, the plan to use brothels to increase the productivity of forced laborers didn't go the way the Nazis hoped. The truth was, very few prisoners were even fit enough to visit the brothels, given the horrible conditions and starvation in the camps. The brothels, however, served another dark purpose. Heinrich Himmler, a top Nazi leader, also wanted to use them to cure homosexuality. Prisoners who wore the pink triangle, marking them as gay, were forced to visit the brothels once a week. This was supposed to teach them to desire women. It wasn't about pleasure, it was yet another way for the Nazis to control, humiliate, and hurt. When the war finally ended, and the truth about the concentration camps came to light, the camp brothels were barely spoken of. They became a subject no one wanted to touch. The women who had been forced to work in them were too traumatized to speak up, while the men who had used the brothels remained silent out of shame. Even when survivors began seeking compensation for the horrors they had endured, the women who had been in the brothels were left out. Because their work was labeled as voluntary, they were not eligible for damages. Most of them chose to stay silent, afraid of being judged or shunned, just like they had been by other prisoners during the war. The reality of these brothels was one of the many horrific aspects of life under Nazi control. It showed the lengths to which the Nazis would go to manipulate and torment those who were already suffering. The brothels weren't about pleasure or comfort. They were just another tool of oppression in a place where freedom had long been forgotten. But this was just the beginning of the dark story. As the war spread to more areas, another kind of nightmare was taking shape. The rise of brothels in Nazi-occupied France. Life in France during the Nazi occupation wasn't just about secret resistance movements, hunger, and hardship. Strangely enough, there was a side to life that might seem surprising, a time that some called the Golden Age of French brothels. That might sound odd, but let's take a closer look at how things unfolded. Before the war, France's brothels were fading away as more people wanted them shut down. The government had nearly outlawed them, and it seemed like these places were on their last legs. But when the German soldiers marched into France, everything changed. The invasion gave the brothels new life. To understand why, we need to rewind to 1940. At the time, France had invested a large sum of money to build the Maginot Line, a massive 280-mile barrier filled with forts and tunnels near the German border. They believed it would keep the enemy out, but the Germans took a different route. Instead of going head-on, they slipped through Belgium and came down from the north, sneaking around the line through the Ardennes Mountains. The French defenses were caught off guard and couldn't keep up with the German blitzkrieg's speed and strength. Within just 6 weeks, France was defeated and the Germans took control. The tough times were only just beginning. World War II is remembered not just because of the huge number of lives lost, but also because of the horrible things that happened, especially to women. Sadly, many French women suffered terribly during the early days of the occupation. In the summer of 1940, right after the invasion, there were countless reports of assaults carried out by German soldiers. Although the German military had laws that forbade sexual assault and even set harsh punishments for it, such rules only protected German women. French women had little protection, and the attackers often got away with it. But as the months went by, something changed. The number of these assaults dropped, and it wasn't by chance. The Germans wanted to keep the French calm and working in factories to help with their war efforts. To make that happen, they tried to paint a picture of the two nations getting along. Punishing a few soldiers helped that image. Some German soldiers who attacked French women were indeed punished, but the sentences were usually light, maybe just a few months behind bars. It was more of a show than real justice, especially when you think about the fact that an estimated 10,000 women were attacked by soldiers throughout the occupation. Brothels, however, became a place where the occupiers could find comfort and distraction, as you will soon find out. The brothel culture in Nazi-occupied France. When the Germans took over France in the summer of 1940, they didn't just conquer the land, they became eager customers for its pleasures. Before the occupation, France already had plenty of brothels, especially around Paris. But after the invaders arrived, business exploded. One big reason for that was money. The Germans fixed the exchange rate so that 1 Reichsmark was worth 20 French francs. That made everything in France, including time spent in brothels, cheap for even the lowest-ranking Nazi soldiers. Soon, German soldiers crowded French brothels like never before. This worried military leaders, who feared that diseases could spread quickly among the troops. As the problem grew, the higher-ups stepped in. In a surprising twist, the German authorities worked with French officials to bring the brothels under control. They set up rules for existing places and even built new ones to meet the rising demand. The situation wasn't as simple as it seemed, though. Thousands of women ended up working in these places, and not all of them had a choice. Some were taken from their homes in the countryside, even as teenagers, and forced to work in the brothels. They weren't allowed to see French men anymore. Only German soldiers were allowed to visit them. The brothels were divided into different categories, depending on the rank of the soldiers who used them. That meant high-ranking officers got to visit the fancier places, which had more luxurious settings and younger women. The Wehrmacht and Schutzstaffel took over at least 22 famous brothels, making them special spots just for military staff and a few French officials who cooperated with the Nazis. Military leaders set the prices, and a small tax was paid to the French authorities who went along with it. The brothels had to be run by a woman, usually a former prostitute who became a madam. In addition to this, the outside of these places had to look quiet and respectable. even though the inside was far from it. In Paris, this world of high-class prostitution took off. The city became known as the most sexually charged place in Europe, with madams and young women helping turn it into a spot where German officers came to escape the harshness of war. The top brothels, sometimes called closed houses, were where the leaders of the Third Reich liked to go. It wasn't unusual for senior Nazis, like Hermann Göring, to drop by. Guards would be stationed outside to make sure no one interrupted their visits. Inside these elite brothels, German officers enjoyed themselves in lavish rooms, surrounded by fine furniture and fancy decor. The madams who ran these places were rewarded well for keeping everything in line. They didn't just get paid hefty fees. They also received gifts, like art stolen from other countries. In fact, the money earned from just one night at some of these brothels was often more than a senior officer's weekly salary. To keep up appearances, the soldiers were encouraged to bring treats for the women, like champagne, chocolates, and cigarettes. This made the brothels seem more like gentlemen's clubs than places of desperation. The Germans even put out a guidebook listing the brothels, and it became almost like a map for soldiers looking to enjoy the nightlife in occupied Paris. Yet, while the wealthy madams and high-ranking officers indulged in luxury, the rest of France struggled to survive. For many, the brothels were a harsh reminder of how deeply the war had affected every part of life. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. From champagne baths to forbidden love. Some stories from the brothels during the German occupation might surprise you. Not all the women felt completely trapped. Some even embraced their new life in unexpected ways. A few prostitutes were so eager to please their German patrons that they learned to speak the language and put on classical music concerts. They thought these efforts might impress the soldiers and make their lives a bit easier. But there was more than just music. Late-night parties at places like Le Chabanais, the fanciest brothel in Paris, went far beyond ordinary entertainment. This brothel was known for its wild luxuries, including baths filled with champagne and a special seat crafted to enhance pleasure. The building itself was full of exotic-themed rooms, such as the Moorish room and the Hindu chamber, where Nazi officers would retreat with the women. Le Chabanais wasn't the only brothel the Germans took over. There was also Le Sphinx, a place with history stretching back to the 17th century, and the famous 122. The 122 stood out for its lavish style. The place was constantly being refreshed, with 2 gardeners always on duty to keep its extravagant flower grotto in perfect shape. Inside, solid marble pedestals were set up for women dressed as Greek goddesses to showcase themselves. The theme rooms were equally over the top, designed to look like cabins on ocean liners or train carriages from the Orient Express. The soldiers often indulged in these pleasures with more intensity before a big military mission. For example, during the summer of 1941, right before the invasion of Russia, the excitement in these brothels reached a fever pitch. The troops, enjoying their time in Paris, knew that soon they would be headed to the harsh front lines in the east. But it wasn't all fun and games. The women working in the brothels had to follow strict rules. They were required to get medical checkups every 2 weeks. If any of them were found to have sexually transmitted diseases, they were treated and kept in confinement until they were healthy again. This practice wasn't new. It went back to the time of Napoleon. The French emperor had ordered similar inspections for prostitutes in the early 1800s, setting a standard that carried into the war years. Hitler admired Napoleon and drew some inspiration from his policies, including the management of the brothels in Paris and other major cities. The relationships between the women and the soldiers didn't always end with the brothels, though. By the end of the occupation, around 500,000 babies were born to Franco-German parents. In 1942 alone, there were 200,000 of these births. Not all of these children came from violent encounters or from brothel workers. In fact, many French women entered into relationships with German soldiers willingly. The reasons were often simple: the complicated lives of women under Nazi rule. Life in occupied France wasn't just about the fighting or secret resistance. It was also about survival, and food was scarce. While German soldiers enjoyed around 2,000 calories a day, French people had to get by on barely half of that. For some, it wasn't enough. and they faced hunger daily, but it wasn't just food they lost. As the war went on, the Germans took everything they could from France. It started with gold and priceless art, but soon, even basic things like wax, textiles, and leather were carted off back to Germany. Life wasn't just hard because of the lack of food and supplies. The French had another reason to be careful. Nazi Germany held 2 million young French men, soldiers captured during the war, as hostages. The message was clear: if the people rebelled, these men could be killed. So, ordinary people had little choice but to follow German orders. For many, that meant living in fear, with husbands, brothers, and fiancés locked away in far-off prisoner-of-war camps. This harsh reality forced some women to make tough choices just to survive. With so many men gone, money was hard to come by. Some women felt they had no choice but to offer themselves in exchange for money or goods. Many ended up working in rundown, lower-class brothels. The situation was so desperate that, according to social commentator Patrick Buisson, a girl could earn up to 3 times the daily allowance given to the wives of prisoners of war in less than an hour by selling her body to the German occupiers. About 10,000 women in Paris became occasional prostitutes during the occupation, with the number of full-time sex workers skyrocketing compared to before the war. The huge profits from this work weren't the only reason some women warmed up to the Germans, though. Believe it or not, some were charmed by the way the German officers behaved. They found them polite and well-mannered, not like the scary image they might have expected. It's likely that some women even fell in love with the soldiers they met. After all, not every relationship was just a transaction. There were quite a few marriages between French women and German men during the war, showing that some bonds went deeper than just survival. When the D-Day landings began in Normandy, marking the start of France's liberation, things took a turn. Many women who had fallen in love with Germans, or even married them, chose to follow their husbands and boyfriends back to Germany. It was a risky move, but for some, love, or maybe a sense of loyalty, was stronger than fear of what lay ahead. Speaking of the liberation, when the Allies freed France, things didn't go well for many women who had been with German soldiers. As the war's tides shifted, so did the fate of those women. Before we continue with the rest of the video, let's take a look at today's subscriber's pick. This image shows a grim scene from World War II with soldiers standing around a figure lying on the ground. The soldiers look serious, dressed in heavy coats with guns in their hands. The figure on the ground is in a humiliating position, bound by ropes. The image suggests punishment or intimidation, which are common tactics used by Nazi soldiers during the war to assert power and control. Behind them, the background shows damaged buildings, giving off a war-torn look that adds to the darkness of the situation. This is what the Nazi brothels were like from the inside. Life was harsh, and the prisoners experienced constant fear and abuse. Those forced to work in these brothels often faced unimaginable cruelty, as they were treated as nothing more than objects to satisfy soldiers. Even the surroundings in the brothels had a cold, unwelcoming atmosphere that matched the pain the women experienced. Looking at this image, it's hard to imagine the level of suffering those involved went through. What do you think about the harsh conditions these prisoners faced daily? How does this image make you feel about the true horrors of war? Share your thoughts in the comments section. The dark fate of women in brothels in post-war France. When France was finally freed from German control, the end of the occupation didn't bring peace for everyone. Some women, especially those who had been with German soldiers, found themselves in serious trouble. It didn't matter if these women were prostitutes just trying to make a living, or if they had fallen in love with their oppressors. Many of them were seen as traitors. From 1943 to 1946, punishment for women accused of collaborating with the Germans became brutal. Groups of angry locals would storm homes and drag these women out into the streets. Often the women were taken to public squares where large crowds gathered, eager to watch. Their heads were shaved, a harsh act meant to shame them. Sometimes things got even worse. Some women were stripped of their clothes and had swastikas carved into their foreheads before being beaten by the mob. Head shaving as a public punishment wasn't new. It had been used before, including after World War I when French soldiers occupied the Rhineland in 1923. Back then, German women who had relationships with the French were given the same treatment. And during World War II, Nazi officials had ordered that German women caught with non-Aryans or prisoners working on farms should also have their heads shaved in public. This practice became common in France after the D-Day landings. Once the Allies or resistance fighters took control of a town, the humiliations began. The streets became a stage for what some called an ugly carnival. In mid-June, just after the town of Carentan was freed, around a dozen women were publicly shorn on market day. In Cherbourg, not long after, a truck drove through town carrying young women, many of them teenagers, as people jeered and watched. In another village, Villedieu, one woman suffered the same punishment simply because she had worked as a cleaner for the German military. It wasn't just the women who faced backlash. The brothels that thrived during the occupation also became targets of anger and reform. After the war, France wanted to erase the memories of those years, and the famous brothels were seen as symbols of shame. One of the loudest voices against the brothels was Yvonne de Gaulle, the wife of Charles de Gaulle, the war hero and new president of France. A devout Catholic, she made it known that she despised the brothels and wanted them gone. She wasn't alone. Martha Richard, a Paris city councillor and former prostitute, also called for the brothels to close. She argued that they were too deeply tied to the Nazi era to continue operating. Due to their efforts, the Loi de Marthe Richard, a law that officially banned the maisons closes, was passed on April 13, 1946. The once lavish brothels didn't stand a chance. In just a few months, the elegant interiors that once hosted powerful men were torn apart and destroyed. The brothels themselves were repurposed. The 122, once famous for its extravagant decor, is now an office building. A firm of accountants works there today, a far cry from the wild nights that once defined it. Le Chabanais, another favorite haunt for men like Göring, has also changed. What used to be a playground for the rich and powerful has been transformed into upscale apartments. The end of these brothels marked the closing of a dark chapter in French history, but the story doesn't end there. The Nazis had taken their obsession with control and domination to even darker places. Some of the worst horrors were yet to be uncovered. The reality of Nazi brothels in Poland and beyond. The horrors that unfolded in Poland during the war were beyond heartbreaking. In cities across the country, mass raids targeted young women who were dragged away by German soldiers. Many of these girls ended up in military-run brothels, where they were forced into a nightmare of abuse and exploitation. It wasn't just in Poland either. This nightmare spread far and wide, touching other countries too. But in Poland, things were especially terrible. The women weren't just captured for brothels. Many were also taken to Germany as slave labor. Once there, they were often abused by German men who treated them as property. Some came back pregnant, like 2 Polish teens who returned to Krakow, showing signs of their cruel treatment. These girls revealed that they had endured so much, they couldn't even carry out the labor they had been assigned. And life inside the brothels was a brutal cycle. Women could be violated by up to 32 men in a single day, with no escape in sight. Those who became visibly pregnant were sometimes released, but shame often kept them from going home. In 1942, Franz Mawick, a Swiss Red Cross worker, witnessed a chilling scene in Warsaw. He saw German soldiers staring at women between 15 and 25. One soldier shined a flashlight straight into a woman's face. She asked him for some bread, but instead of showing mercy, he laughed and told her she would get nothing but a kick. He then turned his light onto a younger girl, just barely 15, and started touching her roughly, while his companions joked about how perfect she was for them. Over in the Soviet Union, German forces committed similar atrocities. There, women were also captured off the streets, dragged by their hair, and thrown into brothels set up for German officers. In the city of Smolensk, a hotel had been turned into one such place. It didn't matter who the women were or what their circumstances had been before. The war showed no mercy, and neither did their captors. Amid all this horror, some women still found the strength to resist. According to the Polish magazine N4ZI, a group of Polish and Soviet women held in a German military brothel in Norway managed a daring escape in 1941. They found refuge inside a local Lutheran church, which offered them shelter. Their courage in such bleak circumstances was remarkable. But for many, these small acts of defiance could not undo the trauma of their experiences. As the war unfolded, the stories of these women became buried beneath the weight of history. The suffering they endured was often left untold, and their voices silenced. The horrors faced by these women were a cruel part of a dark chapter in history that will never be forgotten. It's a painful past, but one that must be acknowledged to honor the strength of those who lived through it. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.